Welcome to Waxman Strategy's Environmental Policy webinar. We're really happy to have you. I'm Glenn Hurwitz, the Managing Director of Waxman Strategies, and I lead our environmental practice. For those of you who aren't super familiar with us, Waxman Strategies is a mission-driven consulting firm that uses policy, campaigns, and communications to solve complex problems and achieve outcomes that matter. I am really pleased today to be joined by my colleagues, Rose Gar, who's our Senior Director for U.S. Environmental Policy, Michael Gu, who's the former EPA Policy Director, also former staff director of the Select Committee on Global Warming, as well as Chief Counsel for Energy and Environment on the Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as many other positions on the Hill for decades. And in several of those positions, he worked with the star of the hour, Henry Waxman, former chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the Oversight Committee, and the person who authored the 1990 Clean Air Acts, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and many other pieces of legislation throughout his 40 years on Capitol Hill. We are really happy to have you. We work at Waxman Strategies on healthcare, technology, and the environment. In the environmental practice, we focus on addressing climate change, protecting threatened landscapes, promoting sustainable agriculture, and conserving oceans. A lot of our work is international, but today we're going to focus primarily on U.S. policy and especially on the new Congress. I think one of the things just to know about us is we're a double threat. We work both the inside game policy, lobbying here in Washington and elsewhere, but we also run field campaigns and do communications and online organizing. So we hope that the entire package can help achieve major environmental goals. We're going to go into some of those big picture issues later. We'll be talking for about 30-40 minutes. Please send us your questions. You can do that by sending an email to info@waxmanstrategies.com or just tweet us at Team Waxman. First off, though, I'm going to hand it over to Henry Waxman to give us some perspective on where we're at this political moment and what are the big environmental opportunities. So, Henry, notwithstanding the remarkable Democratic success in taking a lot of seats in the House of Representatives, we still have a divided Congress and a hostile administration. What is it possible to accomplish on climate and environment more broadly in the next session of Congress?
We won't have the ability to pass major legislation because the president would veto it, the Senate probably wouldn't take it up, but having the House of Representatives in Democratic hands means a lot. We could stop bad legislation from passing because it does have to have approval of the House and the Senate as well as the president. But there are two things that the House of Representatives can undertake. They can do oversight, which I maintain is always as important as legislation, because sometimes by just focusing attention on a problem, it makes a huge difference. It may even resolve the problem without legislation itself. We can do oversight in the House, and the House can do hearings to talk about the issues, why we have a Clean Air Act, why we need to do something about climate change, to ask why we are pulled out of the Paris Agreement, go into even the corruption at the Environmental Protection Agency, the reason we don't have the power plan any longer, and what answers the Republican administration has to deal with climate change. President Trump says he doesn't believe it happens, that we're having a climate episode because of carbon emissions. Well, his belief should not cancel out the whole record of science. So there's a lot this House of Representatives can do. In 2 years from now, when I hope we'll get a president to replace this one that will want to do something about the climate issue, we can develop a public opinion that will demand that legislation. We can try to convince Republicans and Democrats to join together, to work together. And we can continue the great efforts that you've been doing in getting the private sector to push from the outside for the kind of changes we need in environmental policy. I'm not real hopeful we can get a lot of legislation passed, but we ought to pursue the opportunity. If the president wants an infrastructure bill, there's a lot we can do in green infrastructure. if we can do something about the renewable fuel standard that has led to use of ethanol and corn for fuel instead of for food, which is destroying not just huge parts of the land in this country, but all around the world, that would be a great accomplishment. And maybe we can get more efficiency standards adopted in the use of energy. Certainly, we ought to highlight the fact that this is not a time for us to weaken automobile emission standards, as the Trump administration is proposing to do, or stop California and other states, since they always say, Republicans say, let's let the states handle it. Let them make their own efficiency standards for motor vehicles. A lot can be done. I'm looking forward to the next couple of years, and I think the leadership in the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the chairs of the committee will be out front, pushing the issue, educating the public, setting the stage for after the 2020 election, and maybe taking some opportunities to pass some things now.
Right. So you've worked closely with Pelosi, with the other members of leadership. You're up on the Hill in communication with committee chairmen and other key members of Congress. There's been a lot of calls, especially from new members of Congress and others, for the House Democrats to not just talk about climate change, but actually pass real legislation. There's a call for a Green New Deal that would shift us 100% away from fossil fuels by 2050. Others have urged probably a more cautious approach to focus mostly on exposing the reality of climate change. What do you think is a good strategy, and what do you think Speaker Pelosi and the other leadership are going to pursue?
Well, I think they ought to put all these things on the table. We wanted to do something to limit carbon pollution. When I was chairman of the committee, we took the work of a group of business executives and environmentalists, the Climate Action Partnership, and we used that as the basis for our legislation because it had a lot of business support. And we thought maybe Republicans still think of themselves as the party representing business, but they could care less what business had to say. But we had a cap and trade bill. When that didn't pass the Senate, even though it passed the House, we said, okay, let's do a carbon tax. And then we were told, you could do a carbon tax, but you may want to do it to lower the deficit, but we want to do it to lower other taxes. I said, fine, let's do that. Let's just do something. I remember turning to the top Republican on our committee, and I said, we're willing to do a cap and trade. We're willing to do a carbon tax. We're willing to use the carbon tax money for lowering the deficit and lowering other taxes. What do you propose to do? And there was absolute silence. They weren't as bold as President Trump to say they don't believe there's a problem, but they didn't have any ideas for it and how to handle it. And now the American people are starting to realize this is not a problem for way down in the century. It's happening right now with the drought and the storms, the hurricanes, the climate that we never imagined we would see, and we're suffering from today.
Yeah, I mean, your home state of California has been experiencing these horrible fires that have poisoned the air for millions of people, and it's kind of shocking to see that in the United States. Yeah. So we talked a lot about legislation. You also raised the oversight opportunity, and you know about oversight. I mean, one of the highlights of your career was you hauled the CEOs of the major tobacco companies before your committee, and that famous photo of them raising their hands and denying connections between tobacco and cancer and addiction is actually, you were the person asking them the questions and interrogating them. Are there opportunities like that in the new Congress?
Oh, there are many opportunities for oversight. Along the lines of the tobacco executives, we could ask the oil companies why they try to hide the facts of the connection between burning fossil fuels and climate problems. There are a lot of things they knew. But the real important things to do in oversight is to talk about why we have done things in the past. Maybe even go back to basics. Why did we pass a clean air law? We did it because we didn't want people to have to breathe unhealthy air. We didn't think that every area would be polluted by a fire, as is now happening in California, but it was obvious that people were breathing in polluted air that was damaging their health. And so the Clean Air Act said, clean up the air in the local areas where you live and develop a list of all the sources of the pollution, and then reduce the sources of the pollution and develop a plan with the federal and state governments working together. This was bipartisan. Last reauthorization of the Clean Air Act in 1990 was passed overwhelmingly by Democrats and Republicans together, and it was signed by a Republican president, President George H.W. Bush. So we've got to restore bipartisanship, not by hoping they'll join us, but waiting for them to join us. No, we got to move forward, but by educating them as well as the public that there are things we can do, and oversight is the way to do it.
Great. Maybe passing over to Michael now to develop some of what Henry talked about a little further. Could you talk about some of the specific issues like fuel economy in California, which Henry mentioned? That's one of the most important U.S. climate policies, probably the biggest climate policy achievement of the Obama administration. What happens now? It's been under threat from regulation, regulatory rollbacks from the Trump administration. What can we expect there?
Well, the Clean Air Act allows California to set its own standard for vehicles, and California's been a leader in this area and has been pushing with greenhouse gas standards and fuel economy standards. The Trump administration has attempted to roll this back. We'll see whether or not they're successful, but it's a very dramatic attack on a core part of the Clean Air Act and a core part of environmental protection. And I expect that there'll be oversight with regard to that by the new incoming Democratic Congress. So we'll see how that plays out in the courts and in the Congress.
Are there opportunities through the appropriations process to stop this and the many other environmental rollbacks that we've seen coming from the Trump administration?
There could be opportunities, of course, since we have a Republican Senate and we have a Republican administration. Appropriations, those kinds of things need to be bipartisan. So there certainly will be efforts in the House to look at that and to see whether or not that can be used as a tool. But again, with this divided government scenario that we have to have bipartisanship.
The Democratic majority in the House is, probably somewhat more progressive than the diverse Democratic majorities we've seen in the past, but it still, represents the whole gamut of opinions. Are there environmental issues that you see as unifying that can actually be used not only to build the case for strong climate and environmental action, but also be used as an effective political cudgel against the Republicans?
Well, I think there are a lot of opportunities for bipartisanship, and I think that, for instance, we've seen recently, just the other day, the introduction of a carbon tax by a bipartisan group of members. There is a small but growing cadre of members in the Republican Party who are admitting that climate change is a problem and that they need to do something about it. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of solutions that I think we can look at that don't go the full way to a complete climate bill like the Waxman-Markey bill that Henry passed, but there will be opportunities to look, especially, for instance, in the area of energy innovation, those kinds of things.
Yeah. And I was going to add to that, one of the interesting takeaways from the midterms that happened on November 7th, we now have a sizable Democratic majority that will come into the next Congress. But among the Republicans that lost their seats include Carlos Curbelo, who was a Republican from Florida. He headed up the Climate Solutions Caucus, which has come under criticism for not doing enough. But Representative Curbelo had sponsored a climate change bill. And so we are going to lose some Republican allies that had been on our side on figuring out solutions to climate change. That said, the Democrats that are replacing these Republicans include, and I think that when you say that they're across the spectrum, I would actually say that they might be more progressive, and they include more women. They're more diverse than what we've had before. And I think that we're already seeing that they are putting pressure on House leadership to advance a more urgent environmental and climate agenda than what we've seen so far.
So building off of what Rose said, Henry, you've talked so many times in the past about the importance of building bipartisan coalitions to pass major legislation. Given the fact that we've lost some of the few pro-climate Republicans, given your own experience passing the Waxman-Markey legislation in the House, do you feel that the rules have changed? Is it possible to pass ambitious legislation of any kind with Republican support, or is this the era of one party rule?
We used to have Democratic and Republican parties that were big tents, and we had conservative Democrats, but we had liberal Republicans. I don't know Mr. Corbello, whether he's liberal or not, but if he's coming from Florida, his constituents want something to be done about the problem of climate. The Floridians have two Republican senators. If they just step back and say, well, this is not a problem, I don't think they're going to be able to win their re-elections when people more and more are seeing the hurricanes and the flooding and all the environmental damage. Anyway, but to your question, you always hope to get bipartisanship. You don't approach the issue of just getting the Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other, but you approach the issue and not approach it as a partisan issue, because environmental issues have never been partisan issues. So we talk about the issues. We talk about some solutions. We say to elected members, if you don't want to vote for this, at least vote for this. If you don't want to vote for that, how about this? Explore some ways of dealing with it. But do it all in public. Hearings to show why we need to do things. And if every Republican acted like Trump and says, I just don't see it when it comes to climate change, that's not a party that's going to succeed. But we don't have liberal Republicans.
Right.
It's a shame. We still have some moderate to conservative Democrats, but it used to be the Southern Democrats, who are now all Republicans, that were the most conservative, and in the Northeast we had liberal Republicans. Now, on some issues, the partisanship has left a big gap, but you just have to keep working at it and not approaching it from a partisan point of view, but from the issue itself. And when people see you're trying to deal with the issue, they'll push their representatives. And if they don't do it, at least their representatives will learn more about it and take their elected position responsibly.
Yeah. Can I ask a question on this?
Yeah.
One of the issues that we've been following are the state initiatives and questions and referendums that have to do with renewable energy and with climate change. And in the elections earlier this month, the results on those questions and initiatives was really a mixed bag. So Arizona and Nevada had renewable energy standards and supports that both passed. The Arizona one has to get reaffirmed in 2020, but it's looking like that those states are going to see new expanded markets for wind power and solar power. But on the disappointing side, Colorado, there was a question on the ballot there to essentially to limit fracking. The voters voted that down. And then in Washington state, there was a carbon tax or a carbon fee, as they called it there on the ballot, and that lost. And, being from Washington state, that was particularly just disappointing to see, especially in such a solid blue state, to see that the voters there wouldn't approve that price on carbon. So do we have takeaways or thoughts on, what could this have been done better? Was the time not right? If we can't win this in a blue state now, where are we headed?
Well, I think that we should recognize that there are individual fights going on in each of these states. But when the opposition to standards or fracking or whatever was on the ballot, tremendous amount of money was spent by industry to scare people. And so that's a tough way to legislate, to have it on the ballot. But by and large, when matters have been on the ballot, despite the overwhelming spending by the fossil fuel industries, environmental positions have done very well. And certainly in California we've done well, but other places as well. And the partisanship doesn't really impact the thinking about it. They look at, here's an environmental proposal that will clean up the environment and protect public health, and the opposition is the oil companies or the coal companies. Sometimes people don't realize who's funding the opposition. They hear the scary words. But any time in California when we had a ballot proposal where the oil companies were the main funder, for or against, they don't do well. So we need more, well, it goes to the question of changes in our campaign laws. But I wouldn't be too discouraged by the losses. Fracking, some people who are good environmentalists think fracking can play an important role in helping us become energy independent. It has to be done in a responsible way. Some people say, no, it can't be done in a responsible way. And they could both be on the liberal side of things, and let alone those who say, we want jobs, we don't care what harm we're doing to the environment. So there are different points of view and subtle differences, and we've got to try, when we put something on the ballot or advance a policy, advance something that can have a bipartisan, broad spectrum support.
Great. I'm just going to interrupt and say to the audience, if you would like to ask questions, you can tweet them to @TeamWaxman or email us at info@waxmanstrategies.com. Rose, I think great question, and I think it's a challenge for the environmental movement. For me, I have always been skeptical of the idea that a carbon tax would be more appealing because it's a tax, and traditionally those are more challenging to pass. I think we have seen caps pass through state legislatures, many state legislatures now, notably California, and then in California survive on a referendum. Ultimately, the biggest challenge is the imbalance of spending that you typically see from fossil fuel and polluting industries in referenda. So I hope that state legislatures like Washington will pursue ambitious climate action despite some of the structural challenges with referenda.
Well, there's been no greater leader on environmental protection and climate change than Governor Jay Inslee, and so he's certainly doing everything he can. I work with him in the Congress, and I know he cares deeply about this issue.
Absolutely. And a potential presidential candidate, one of 4,000 or 5,000 of them. So
take me off the list.
Okay. Well, I guess my next year, I'll have to scratch my plans for the next 2 years then. But anyway, I did want to get back to a couple of other major congressional issues or federal issues that have interaction between Congress and the White House. Rose, first off, infrastructure. There has been, for the last 2 years, a lot of talk about the potential for a bipartisan breakthrough, even when Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. Of course, infrastructure could mean anything. When you hear Trump talk about it, it doesn't sound particularly green. It sounds like more coal plants, more highways, a border wall that would, is, among other things, a total environmental disaster that would divide the Southwest ecosystems. So do you see hope for an actually green infrastructure bill that could somehow get past Trump's signature?
That's an excellent question. Do I see hope? Yes. Would I guarantee it? No. When the Trump administration, put out their principles or plan for an infrastructure bill a year ago, it was, much like you said, an environmental disaster. It weakened and rolled back all the environmental reviews. It asked the states to pay and private entities to pay for the bulk of the program as well. And yet we need infrastructure improvements. And Speaker Pelosi has said that she wants to do this. There's folks on both sides of the aisle saying that they want to. In our ideal world, a green infrastructure bill could include grid modernization, energy efficiency, like you talked about, supports for renewable energy, mass transit, and then of course road and bridge repairs, which we desperately need. So how that will progress, it's going to be an enormous bill. I can't say for sure, but I'm hopeful that Democrats, can fight for what would be good for the environment.
Great. Michael, anything on that, but I had another question for you, which is there's one of the things that the Trump administration has been pursuing has been really dramatic and sad rollbacks to some of our basic public lands and wildlife protections. Congress and the White House has been proposing weakening the Endangered Species Act, whether by rolling back specific protections for individual species like gray wolves, or more broadly weakening the Endangered Species Act. Land and Water Conservation Fund has been under attack. And many of the monuments that President Obama, and even going back to President Clinton with the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument, Trump has been trying to undo. What does the change in control of the House do to some of those really quite frightening rollbacks to our public lands?
Well, of course, the good news is that they won't be able to pass those as a legislative matter, so that's huge. And that's the electorate speaking, that they want to have some controls and checks on the Trump administration's agenda, which has really ravaged public lands, appointed a Secretary of Interior who is really clearly not friendly to the environment and to multi-use public lands. So, but there are some hopeful things. You mentioned the Land and Water Conservation Fund. There seems to be bipartisan support for that. Right now, there's some opposition on the Republican side, so it may or may not happen in this lame duck Congress. But clearly, with the new Democrats taking over the House and the new Congress coming in January, we should have a solid chance of reauthorizing that, perhaps on a permanent basis. So that would be a huge plus for us.
And whether in your work at AJW or with Waxman, to what extent do you see the appropriations process as a viable opportunity for stopping a lot of this? Because that's been used a lot in the past. I think it's something that's not been explored that much so far.
Yeah, there again, as I mentioned before, I think that can be done. But again, President Trump will have to sign whatever's done in the appropriations process. But clearly an issue can be made of funding for Department of Interior or other agencies that play a huge role in these decisions. And one of the things you're going to see oversight that's looking at the basic proper functioning of the government. Is the government functioning properly? Are things being done in the public interest? Is public dollars being spent for the public interest in accordance with the statutes that have been passed by the Congress? And I think clearly we will see that has not been done in many important instances. And then that can be an example that can be taken and possibly bipartisan support can be developed for a appropriations rider or some language in an appropriations report that would suggest that this type of activity needs to stop or it needs to be done in a different way.
Great. Well, moving beyond Congress and indeed beyond policy, as Henry mentioned earlier, one of the major things that we focused on in recent years is how to make progress on environment and climate even when governments are not doing their job. Climate change is still happening. It still needs solutions. And we've seen that some of the most promising, exciting areas is actually that the companies who are causing a lot of the pollution actually have the power to stop that, but they rarely do so unless big public campaigns create pressure on them through their customers, through their investors. So we see a few priority areas I thought I'd just mention to put some of this work in context. First is land use, stopping deforestation and destruction of other native ecosystems, especially by the meat industry, both directly to clear land for cattle grazing and also feed like soy and corn, which has driven massive pollution of Midwest waterways of the Gulf of Mexico, where it's created a giant dead zone. And then overseas is the leading driver of deforestation. So, deforestation alone causes somewhere between 10 and 20% of global emissions. It's greater than the entire transportation sector, greater than the emissions from the entire continent of Europe, and yet it gets only 2% of climate funding. And so our general approach has been to look for huge climate opportunities that are not getting enough attention. We see deforestation that's being driven by companies like Cargill and McDonald's and supermarket chains like Giant as a big problem, and we're going to continue our campaigns through that. We've worked a lot with our partner nonprofit organization, Mighty Earth, on that. That's going to continue. Another big one for us, which we've recently launched, is our campaign to transform the steel industry and heavy industry more broadly. This is really shocking. I think very few people know about this. Heavy industry, which includes steel, cement, paper, chemicals, accounts for around a third of global emissions. The recent IPCC report says that to reach 1.5 degrees, you have to see 80% emissions reduction there, and yet there's almost zero efforts to drive that to happen. So we've recently launched a campaign that's initially focused just on the steel industry. It's called our Stainless campaign because of stainless steel. This is our report, Cold Steel, Hot Climate. The steel industry alone accounts for the emissions equivalent of 569 coal-fired power plants. So we're putting pressure on companies like Nucor, America's biggest steel producer, to shift to clean energy, shift to carbon neutrality. We've actually found a lot of receptivity to that, and that's one of the big opportunities that we see that we don't believe is getting enough attention.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
About that? Nucor is the largest steel manufacturer in the United States, but they are using a process that lends itself to getting renewable fuels to drive the electricity and to help them continue doing their job and prosper. They oftentimes the environmental laws benefit industry, benefit the economy. Sometimes it takes a while for some of those industries to understand it. In Nucor, there seems to be a gap. They have given a lot of money, for example, to groups that fight against climate change and fight against regulations, but they don't have to be regulated. If they just simply change the way they operate, they will help the environment, help fight climate change, and be competitive around the world. When we first did the Clean Air Act, the thing that impressed me the most is some of the groups that fought the hardest against some of the changes saw the best results because it made them more efficient as they tried to be more environmentally sensitive. They became more efficient, they became more competitive, it helped the economy. There's not a conflict. A lot of people say there's a conflict between protecting the environment and helping our economy. There often is no conflict whatsoever. I've been so impressed at the work that Mighty Earth has done, pressing the private sector to make changes without government doing anything to tell them to do it. A lot of them around the world are countries where the government is in the pocket of the industry, and they don't really care that much about the environment or what happens to the people they're representing. Right now, unfortunately, the United States is in that position. We have a president of the United States who doesn't care about these issues. But getting industry to do the right thing can make a huge difference, especially when you don't have government operating, or even when you do. So I think the campaign against steel and other heavy polluting industries is very important. They shouldn't look at it as a hostile act. They should look at it as something they should welcome, because China is going to outpace us on so many of these environmental technologies that we're going to be behind economically and environmentally.
Well said. I mean, we have a map as part of our campaign which shows clean energy prices relative to gas and coal. And in many parts of the country, including where Nucor and other steel plants operate, the clean energy prices are actually lower than fossil fuels, but they're still relying on fossil fuels.
Our entire case here is that this is a better business decision for you to commit to purchasing clean energy. And I hope that they listen.
So
we got to force them to pay attention through the public pressure on them, which many corporations care a lot about. They care about their reputation. So they'll listen when they get hit on the head.
Well, yeah, and especially when customers are demanding it. We are about to have Amazon relocating and establishing a headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area. And it might not happen immediately, but eventually they're going to be building new buildings. And, they can decide what kind of steel that they want to use. Should it be carbon neutral steel? Should it be the cleanest steel possible? And we hope that a company like that could lead the way.
Yeah, Walmart has, for example, been a great leader on environmental issues. They have a lot of employees. They're an important force in the community, and they are looking for opportunities to improve their image, but more importantly, improve the environment.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We did our report on the big supermarkets and fast food restaurants. And Walmart actually scored the best of any of the companies, which I don't think people necessarily associate that image. Now, having said that, they scored a D and everybody else scored an F. So the entire, although they do a really good job on other issues, like they and others have to do a lot more to clean up meat. Unfortunately, there's been very little done to drive meat sustainability, even though it's one of the biggest causes of climate pollution and also causes devastating impacts to other to ecosystems. Finally, one of the big issues that we're focused on that we see as underinvested in is biofuels reform. And as Henry was alluding to, the renewable fuel standard sucks up enormous amounts of soy and corn that could go to into the food supply, and that requires a lot of other areas to be cleared. And we have Rose leads our work on biofuels, and Henry is very actively involved on a day-to-day basis with that on the Hill with the administration. If you haven't seen it, the New York Times Magazine this Sunday published this amazing article about the impact of biofuels, where the reporters spent 9 months in Indonesia looking at the impact of U.S. biofuels policies. They talked a lot to Henry, other people who are working on this issue. Really extraordinary reportage, and I hope you'll look at it. We're looking at how we can build off this and other research to build the case for reform of the biofuels policy, shift away from conventional biofuels. One of the most shocking statistics here is that biofuels produce, solar panels produce 100 times the amount of energy on the same amount of land as biofuels. So we'd like to see a shift to electrification rather than burning these fuels, and that in the short term, shift away from these kinds of fuels like palm oil and soy biodiesel that can be even dirtier than dirty old oil. So that's another of the big issues we're working on, both in Congress and then also working to educate the presidential candidates about that with a grassroots campaign. So stay tuned for that. Anything else to add? We've to wrap up as we're heading into a new Congress. I think a bit of a sense of relief from the existential dread we've been experiencing over the last 2 years. What are the causes for hope in the two? What are you hoping to see good news come out of the next 2 years?
I think there's a great opportunity in the next 2 years for those of us who care about the environment to get public airing of the issues, to do congressional investigations that will draw public attention, and we can set the stage for major legislation after the next presidential election. You've got to educate the public, and we've been blocked out of offering solutions legislatively because Republicans didn't even want to hear about them, but even to talk about it. And I remember when I was in Congress and the Republicans had control, we couldn't get an opportunity to hold a hearing, so we organized a Safe Climate Caucus. And one thing that any member of Congress can do is give a 1-minute speech. And we lined up every day to give a 1-minute speech about climate change. Now we could hold hearings on it. And we could enlist people in the bigger legislative packages, but smaller things that can be done. We could seize the opportunity and with the pressure from the public, once they understand it, I think we're going to win. We're going to eventually win, or we're going to all face dire consequences from climate change and other pollution.
Great. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you to Henry. Thank you to Michael. Thank you to Rose, not only for being here, but all your incredible work on these hard issues. If you want to learn more, our website is waxmanstrategies.com. You can hit us up on Twitter at Team Waxman, email us at info@waxmanstrategies.com. You can also find all of our individual email addresses on the website. Please feel free to contact us to follow up. We're working on a lot of issues and would love to hear your thoughts further. So with that, thanks everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.